Joseph Kahahawai Jr. was born on Christmas Day in Lahaina, Maui, and long before history attached his name to scandal, he was a son, a brother, a football player, a boxer, a guardsman, and a young Native Hawaiian man trying to make a life in Honolulu. Then an accusation pulled him and 4 other local men into one of the most racially charged trials in territorial Hawaii, a trial that ended without a conviction. Before a second trial could ever decide anything, Joseph was taken from near the Judiciary Building with a forged summons, driven to Mānoa, and killed. This episode is based on historical newspaper reporting, court coverage, family remembrance, and later historical accounts of the Massie case and the killing of Joseph. It includes discussion of racialized press coverage, abduction, murder, vigilante violence, and injustice in territorial Hawaii. The original Ala Moana trial ended in a hung jury, and Joseph Kahahawai Jr., Horace Ida, Henry Chang, David Takai, and Ben Ahakuelo were not convicted. Listener discretion is advised. Joseph came into the world on Christmas Day, 1909, in Lahaina. Before his name was printed beside words like accusation, trial, abduction, or murder, he belonged to a family with deep Maui roots. His mother, Esther Anito, was also born on Maui. His father, Joseph Kahahawai Sr., came from Maui too, later making his living as a motorman with Honolulu Rapid Transit. These were working people, island people, family people, the kind of people whose names usually appeared in newspapers only when someone won a bout, played in a game, worked a steady job, got married, died, or had someone left behind to mourn them. Joseph came to Oahu as a boy, and by the time he was a young man, Honolulu was the center of his everyday life. He lived with his mother on Kamakela Lane, off Kukui Street, in a neighborhood where people knew each other by family, by work, by school, by the streets they walked, and by who they were connected to. His life crossed through Kalihi, Palama, Iwalei, Kailua, Lahaina, Waikapu, and Honolulu in small recorded pieces, like flashes from an old photograph. Not enough to give us every part of him, but enough to remind us that he had a life before strangers started arguing over it. He was young during the Great Depression, when life was already hard without scandal or accusation attached to your name. Work mattered, reputation mattered, family mattered, and sports seemed to have mattered too. He was part of a local athletic world where young men tested themselves on football fields and in boxing rings, not because it made them famous, but because it gave them structure, pride, and a place to be seen. His name appears in football coverage with the Kailua Wonders, part of the lineup in a Windward Oahu title season. It appears again in amateur boxing, connected to the 298th Infantry and the National Guard. He fought under his own name, and he was also known in some records as Joe Kalani. Those details may look small on paper. A football lineup, a boxing card, a guard record, a line saying he worked as a machine operator. But those are the pieces that pull him back from the edge of becoming only a victim in someone else's story. He had shoulders that carried work, hands that had rapped for boxing, feet that had stood on fields and in rings, a mother whose home he returned to, a father whose grief would later be dragged into public view, a sister whose existence reminds us that there was a family table with one chair that would never be filled the same way again. He was not perfect, because real people are not built that way. And he was not powerful, because the world he was about to be pulled into belonged to people with more money, more military protection, more access, and more control over the story. He was a young Hawaiian man in territorial Hawaii, living in a place where race, class, and power did not sit quietly in the background. They shaped who was believed. They shaped who was feared. They shaped whose pain became a headline and whose life became disposable. The same was true for the other young men whose names would be bound to his: Horace, Henry, David, and Ben. In old coverage, they are often introduced as defendants, suspects, or accused men. But before that, they were sons of local families too. They had homes, work, friends, flaws, habits, and futures that had not yet been burned into public memory by one terrible case. This story did not damage only Joseph. It marked 5 local men, and it did so in a territory already tense with military presence, racial fear, and mainland judgment. By September of 1931, Honolulu was a city with 2 faces. There was the beauty people wanted to sell to the world: Waikiki, music, moonlight, ocean air, hotels, offices, parties, and the promise of paradise. And then there was the Hawaii underneath the postcard: working neighborhoods, crowded courtrooms, plantation memory, Native Hawaiian grief, Asian immigrant families, local boys watched with suspicion, and a justice system trying to stand upright, while powerful people leaned hard against it. That was the world Joseph was living in when Thalia Massie said something terrible had happened to her after a night in Waikiki. She was young, white, married to a Navy officer, and badly injured. Her pain became public almost immediately. Her accusation did too. And in the days that followed, the machinery of police, press, military influence, race, rumor, fear, and outrage began moving faster than the lives caught inside it. At first, much of the public attention turned toward Horace. He was taken into custody early, held to assist the investigation, and the first legal angle even brushed against the Federal Mann Act before local authorities took over. Then the circle widened. Joseph, Henry, David, and Ben were pulled in with him. Their names began appearing together, not as boys from families anymore, but as a group, as suspects, as symbols, as proof of whatever people already wanted to believe about Hawaii, about race, about women, about local men, about the law, and about who deserved protection. The 5 denied guilt. Some early reports said they claimed the case was a frame-up and that witnesses could support where they were that night. But once a story like that begins moving through newspapers, it does not wait politely for truth. It gathers speed. It hardens. Mainland papers looked toward Hawaii and saw danger. Military circles saw insult. Local communities saw something else. Young men being swallowed by a story that had already become bigger than evidence. For Joseph, the shift must have been brutal. 1 year, his name could sit in the sports pages, tied to football and boxing. The next, it was printed inside one of the most racially charged accusations in territorial Hawaii. And from that moment on, ordinary details of his life became vulnerable to being used against him. Where he lived, who he knew, what he had done, what someone said he had done. Even silence could be turned into something. Even confusion could be made to look like guilt. That is what power does when it wants a story to be simple. It removes the person. It leaves the label. But Joseph was still a person. So were the 4 young men standing beside him. And before the courtroom, before the deadlocked jury, before the forged summons, before the gunshot in Mānoa, they were 5 local men standing under the weight of a territory that had already started deciding what kind of story it wanted them to belong to. The trial that followed was tense, crowded, and watched closely. It was not just a courtroom anymore. It was a stage where Hawaii's deepest pressures were being acted out in public. There were questions about routes, timing, identification, statements, evidence, and memory. Joseph and David took the stand in their own defense and denied guilt. Their accounts of the route home from Waikiki Park did not line up perfectly. And Joseph explained that he had been groggy, dizzy, and sleepy, not paying close attention to the streets. That kind of detail can sound small until a person's freedom depends on it. Then every street name becomes a weapon. Every uncertainty becomes something someone can twist. There were other problems too. Police reports were said to have gone missing from the files. Witnesses gave testimony that did not make the story cleaner. Weather, timing, car routes, identification, and memory all became part of the fight. And underneath it all was the deeper question that never really left the room. Were these 5 men being judged by evidence or by what the public had already been taught to fear? For days, the jury carried that question, then for more days. 97 hours passed before the trial finally ended in a deadlock. No conviction, no verdict, no final answer from the law. Joseph, Horace, Henry, David, and Ben were not convicted. But a mistrial does not always feel like freedom when the whole territory is watching you. The accusation still hung over them. A second trial was still possible. Their names still belonged to the papers, to gossip, to military anger, to public frustration, to people who believed the jury had failed before they ever heard all that the jury had heard. That is where the story turns from injustice into something even darker. On January 8th, 1932, Joseph was still alive, still young, still waiting inside a legal process that had not finished. That morning, he went to the Judiciary Building because that was what the law required of him. He was not hiding. He was not running. He was moving through the same system that had accused him, the same system that had failed to convict him, the same system that was supposed to decide what happened next. Then came the paper. A summons, a false one. A document made to look official enough that Joseph would believe it. Later, the newspapers would show it to the public like a relic, calling it his death warrant. There is something especially cruel about that. A young man already trapped inside the machinery of the law was taken by a fake piece of that same machinery. Not by force at first, not by a gun in the open, by the appearance of authority. He was lured away from the place where justice was supposed to live. Joseph was taken to a house in Mānoa, a bungalow rented by Grace Fortescue, Thalia's mother. Inside, the people who had decided the law had not given them what they wanted tried to get something from him that the courtroom had not produced. They wanted a confession. They wanted certainty. They wanted him to give them the ending they believed they deserved. He did not walk out alive. He was shot. His body was later found in a car, wrapped and bound, as the people involved appeared to be moving him away from the house. Police stopped the car near Cocoa Head Road. Inside were Grace, Thomas Massie, and E.J. Lord. Albert Jones was connected to the killing as well, and was later held with them. The case that had begun with Joseph accused of violence now had another crime at its center. This time, Joseph was not the accused. He was the dead. The first reports moved quickly. The Navy was immediately part of the story, not just because of who had been arrested, but because of where they were held and how much tension surrounded the case. Shore leave became an issue. Public safety became an issue. Where the trial should happen became an issue. Whether the Navy or territorial courts would carry the weight of the moment became an issue. But beneath all of that was one plain fact. Joseph, 22 years old, had been kidnapped and killed before a second trial could ever begin. Honolulu would mourn him. His family would bury him. But before his story could settle into grief, the killing became another courtroom battle, another public spectacle, another place where powerful names threatened to crowd out the young man at the center. The investigation into his death began filling in the physical pieces: the forged summons, the car, the rope, the clothing, the blood, the bungalow, the bullet, the body. Detectives, medical witnesses, police officers, and courtroom witnesses would later bring those pieces into court. They were not abstract things. They were the remains of a young man's last morning. And then his family was pulled even deeper into the public wound. Esther had already lost her son. Then she was brought into court and asked to identify the garments he had been wearing on the day he died. She wept as she did it. That image should not get lost behind the names people usually remember from this case. Not behind Darrow, not behind Fortescue, not behind Massie. A mother had to sit in a courtroom and identify her son through the clothing death left behind. The murder trial became a spectacle almost immediately. Clarence Darrow came to Hawaii for the defense, and his presence gave the mainland press another reason to look. The courtroom filled. People waited for seats. Women brought coffee and chairs for the long vigil. Newspapers described drama, strategy, emotion, and performance. And through all of that, Joseph could have disappeared from his own murder trial if the story was not held carefully. The defense gave its version. Massie took the stand and described what he said happened inside the Mānoa house. His testimony was treated by some writers almost like theatre, something persuasive, something dramatic, something to be measured by its effect on the room. That is how quickly a murdered man can be moved to the side when the people accused of killing him have status, sympathy, and a famous lawyer. But the prosecution had its own story to build, and it was not built from emotion alone. It was built from the body, the car, the rope, the bullet, the blood, the clothing, the forged document, and the witnesses who traced the movements of that morning. The question was no longer whether Joseph had been accused in the Ala Moana case. The question was whether 4 people had the right to take him, interrogate him, kill him, and carry his body away. A jury answered that question in April. Grace, Thomas, Lord, and Jones were found guilty of manslaughter, not murder. Manslaughter. Even that verdict came with leniency urged almost immediately, as if the court had to acknowledge the killing, but soften the weight of it at the same time. The jury had been out more than 49 hours. When the verdict came, each defendant heard it separately. Guilty of manslaughter. Guilty, guilty, guilty. For Joseph's family, there was at least a legal acknowledgement that he had been wrongfully killed. But acknowledgement and justice are not the same thing. Judge Charles Davis sentenced the 4 to up to 10 years. For a moment, the law seemed to have spoken in a voice that meant something. Then Governor Lawrence Judd reduced the sentence to 1 hour. 1 hour. A sentence so small it almost sounds like a clerical error until you remember it was real. They were released the same day. Their punishment effectively finished almost as soon as it began. After that 1 hour, the people convicted in Joseph's killing were free to leave the place where his life had ended. They could walk out of the punishment. They could return to rooms, ships, newspapers, supporters, and lawyers. His family could not walk out of what had happened. Esther could not unsee the clothing she had identified in court. His father could not undo the morning his son was taken. And even that 1 hour did not satisfy everyone. In the days after the commutation, there were still voices pushing for more, not more justice for Joseph, more relief for the people convicted in his death. Some wanted full pardons. Some treated the sentence as a burden that should be erased completely. Politicians, civic voices, and powerful supporters kept arguing about what should happen to the killers, while his family was left with the only thing no governor could commute: grief. That political pressure says something important about the world he died inside. The fight was not only about a courtroom verdict. It was about who Hawaii was supposed to protect. It was about whose fear became law, whose outrage became action, whose pain became national news, and whose death could be softened into an inconvenience for the people who caused it. The aftermath reached beyond the courthouse. Hawaiian voters did not simply forget what had happened. The killing, the commutation, and the pressure for pardon became part of a larger question. If a young Hawaiian man could be abducted, killed, and then see his killers serve 1 hour, what did justice mean for local people in their own home? That question did not belong only to Joseph's family. It belonged to the other 4 men too. They had entered the story as accused men, but they left it as people marked by something no jury had proven. Their first trial ended in a deadlock after 97 hours. A second trial never gave Joseph his day back in court, because he was dead before it could happen. Later accounts and reviews would continue to challenge the accusation that had first pulled the 5 into the storm. But by then, the damage had already been done. Their names had been printed. Their faces had been circulated. Their lives had already been altered by a case that moved faster than fairness. That is why this cannot be told only as a scandal among famous names. If it becomes only Thalia, Massie, Fortescue, Darrow, and Judd, then the same thing happens again. Joseph disappears from the center of his own death. The other 4 men become background figures in a story about power. And the family left behind becomes just another detail under the headline. There is a place in this story where the record starts to change shape, not because the facts stop mattering, but because history is made of more than court dates and verdicts. It is also made of what people kept saying after the courtroom emptied, what families carried in silence, and what later generations had to pull back into the light. So this is where we have to be careful. The verified record tells us Joseph was accused, tried, and not convicted. It tells us the first Ala Moana trial ended in a hung jury after 97 hours. It tells us he was killed before any second trial could decide anything. It tells us the people who killed him were convicted of manslaughter, sentenced, and then freed after 1 hour. But around those bones, there has always been another question. What really happened on Ala Moana Road? That question has never sat quietly. It followed Horace, Henry, David, Ben, and Joseph for the rest of their lives, or in Joseph's case, for the rest of the life that was taken from him. And it still shows up now whenever people revisit the Massie case and try to understand how 5 local men became the center of an accusation that changed Hawaii. Some later accounts have gone further than the original trial ever did. They have described the 5 men as falsely accused. They point to contradictions, timing problems, witness issues, racial pressure, and the later independent investigation that challenged the case against them. They point to the fact that all remaining charges were eventually dropped. They point to the silence that followed, not because the story was resolved cleanly, but because the damage had already been done. But this has to be held carefully. The original accusation was real in the sense that it was reported, investigated, and tried in court. Thalia was injured, and she said she had been attacked. That cannot be erased. But accusation is not conviction. And in Joseph's story, that difference is everything. Because he wasn't killed after a jury found him guilty. He was killed after a jury could not. Over the years, public memory is often split in two. One memory centers the famous names: Thalia, Massie, Grace, Darrow, Governor Judd. It treats the story like a legal drama or a scandal of old Honolulu, full of society figures, Navy pressure, courtroom spectacle, and political maneuvering. That version is not completely wrong, but it is incomplete. It has a way of making Joseph disappear, even while using his death to tell the story. The other memory begins somewhere quieter, with family members who carried the name after everyone else moved on, with descendants who have said publicly that the family stayed silent for decades, and that speaking about Joseph again became part of keeping him alive in memory. That kind of remembrance does not sound like a courtroom argument. It sounds like people trying to repair something history left broken. For a long time, his story was not really his own. He was made into a suspect before he was remembered as a son. He was made into a symbol before he was allowed to remain a man. In some public versions, he became almost invisible, reduced to the person whose death caused the famous trial of the people who killed him. But when his family speaks his name, the shape changes. He becomes Joe again, uncle, relative, a life held by people who did not know him personally, but still inherited the wound. There is also online discussion now that tries to correct the old framing. Some public history pages, social posts, and modern retellings describe Joseph and the other accused men as victims of racial injustice, not simply defendants in a sensational case. That shift matters, but it has to be handled with care. Social media can preserve memory, but it can also flatten it. It can turn pain into a caption. It can make certainty out of complicated history. So the safest way to treat those posts is not as proof of every detail, but as evidence that the public memory is changing. People are asking whose story was centered. People are asking why the killers became more famous than the young man they killed. People are asking what Hawaii lost when power was allowed to call itself justice. This is where speculation often enters. People have asked whether the original accusation was shaped by panic, shame, racial fear, political pressure, or something that went wrong earlier that night and was later given another story. But unless a detail is proven, it has to stay outside the verified record. We do not need to invent a private motive to see the public damage. We do not need to know every hidden conversation to understand what happened to Joseph. A young man was accused, never convicted, abducted, and killed. 4 people were convicted in his death and released after 1 hour. That is already enough. The deeper truth may be less about one secret and more about the world that made the killing possible. A world where a white Navy wife's accusation could become a mainland crisis overnight. A world where local men of color could be named, photographed, and judged long before the law finished its work. A world where a mother like Esther could lose her son, then sit in court and identify his clothing, while the public watched the accused killers become objects of sympathy. That is why modern remembrance matters. Not because it gives us every answer, it does not, but because it changes the center of gravity. It says Joseph was family. He was remembered. He was mourned. And the people who carry his name now are part of the story too. The official record can tell us what happened in court. The newspapers can tell us what was printed. Later investigations can tell us why the original accusation was challenged. But memory tells us who had to live with it. Joseph's family lived with it. The other accused men lived with it. Hawaii lived with it. And then there was the funeral. Not as a footnote, not as one more item in the timeline, as the place where the story finally belongs. His body was viewed at Nuanu. People came steadily across lines of race and neighborhood to stand near the casket of a young man whose life had been cut down in public view. His co-defendants came too. The men who had stood beside him in the first trial came to the mortuary because they understood better than anyone how quickly the world had turned on him and how easily it could have been any one of them. Then came the church service, and after that, the procession to Poia Cemetery. The crowd was so large that the streets and cemetery could barely hold it. Some accounts placed the number at more than 1,500. Others put it closer to 2,000. The exact number matters less than what the gathering meant. People came because Joseph was not just a defendant. He was Hawaiian. He was local. He was someone's boy. His father spoke at the grave. Joseph Sr. had asked his son again and again whether the accusation was true, and Joseph had sworn he had done nothing wrong. That moment carries a kind of pain no courtroom can measure. A father standing over his son, telling the living what the dead had told him, not as a legal argument, not as a defense brief, as a father trying to preserve the last truth his child gave him. Esther was there too, carrying a loss that had already forced her into places no mother should have to go. She had lived with him on Kamakela Lane. She had watched his name become public property. She would later sit in court and identify what he wore when he died. But there, at the grave, before the arguments of lawyers and the words of governors, she was simply a mother standing where no mother should have to stand. At the graveside, Reverend Robert Ahuna spoke in Hawaiian. The songs rose over the cemetery, Hawaii Punoi, Kalani Ku'u Home, and Aloha Oe. Those songs matter. They placed Joseph back inside the community that knew how to mourn him. They carried him away from the language of warrants, charges, evidence, and verdicts, and back towards something older and more human. Family, land, memory, home. A Hawaiian language remembrance would later describe him as a child and a native of Hawaii. It spoke of the cruelty of people taking the law into their own hands. And it carried a line that still feels like the truest closing this story can have. He had gone forever, but his memory would not be forgotten. Years later, Esther would also be laid to rest at Poia Cemetery. The same burial ground where Honolulu had once gathered for her son became part of her story too. That detail is quiet, but it matters. After all the noise, after all the headlines, after all the famous names, mother and son remained connected by the same ground. So maybe this story does not end with the governor. It does not end with Darrow. It does not end with the people who served 1 hour and walked away. It ends where Hawaii gathered for Joseph, at the grave, with his father's words, with his mother's grief, with the songs rising over the cemetery, with a young Hawaiian man, 22 years old, returned to his people after the world tried to turn him into an accusation. If this episode stays with you, share it with someone who only knows this story as the Massie case, because Joseph's name deserves to be spoken outside the shadow of the people who killed him. Follow Beneath the Palms wherever you listen, and if this work matters to you, leave a rating or a review. It helps these stories reach people who may have heard the scandal, but never heard the human life at the center of it. Sources for this episode include contemporary reporting from the Honolulu Star Bulletin, the Honolulu Advertiser, the Honolulu Star Advertiser, the Hawaii Tribune Herald, and Hoku o Hawaii, including coverage of the Ala Moana accusation, the 1931 mistrial, Joseph's abduction and killing, the Fortescue Massie murder trial, the manslaughter verdict, the 10-year sentence, the 1-hour commutation, Joseph's funeral, and later public reaction, This episode also draws from the Nupepa blog's rendering of the Hoku o Hawaii Remembrance, PBS American Experience, the University of Hawaii West Oahu Library, the University of Minnesota's Clarence Darrow Digital Collection, StoryCorps, SF Gate, David Stannard's Honolulu Star Advertiser Retrospective, Lois Taylor's Honolulu Star Bulletin Retrospective, and public family and cemetery records connected to Joseph, Esther Anito, and Joseph Kahahawai Sr. Until next time, remember Joseph Kahahawai Jr. as more than a case, more than an accusation, and more than the violence that ended his life. Remember him as a son of Maui, a young man of Hawaii, and someone whose memory survived because his people refused to let it disappear. We close with Aloha Oe, a song that lets the story leave us the way Joseph's community remembered him, with love, grief, and a goodbye that still carries across time. Darkness may linger beneath the palms, but so does hope.